So once again, everybody, I would ask you kindly, if you're moving around, to take your seats. I'm not back to talk about the British Council. I'm back to talk a little bit about our plenary speaker today. And I think I can comfortably say that after 79 years of the British Council in Portugal, it's probably been a rare occasion that we would have had an expert of the nature of the one we have today talking a little bit about to us around the world of assessment and the whys and wherefores. Our speaker today, his recent work includes the development and validation of a new business-to-business language test called APPI. He is the founding president of the UK Association of Language Testing and Assessment. He holds honorary teaching positions and visiting chairs at the University of Reading and Roehampton in the UK, the University of Technology, Mara in Kuala Lumpur, and most recently, the University of Lisbon. In 2016, he was awarded the Fellowship of the Academy of Social Science and has conducted research into factors affecting spoken performance, assessing rate of behavior, assessing speaking, writing, specific purpose assessments, benchmarking English language tests to the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, and standard setting in various professional contexts. In addition to his work, he has worked in Ireland, England, Peru, and Japan, just among a few countries where Barry O'Sullivan, our speaker today, has made his impact on the world of assessment. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Barry to Portugal. Barry, please come up. Thank you.
Good morning. How are you doing? I have to admit that I always get into a nervous panic before I do a talk, and much as we need introductory speeches, they drive me crazy because they just go on and on and on and on, and I get more and more bloody nervous before I start. And I have too much time to think. For example, one of the thoughts I had was the title of my presentation, What Do Teachers Know About Assessment? I must be very brave or very stupid to be a tester, to stand in front of a room full of teachers and say that teachers don't know anything about assessment. Really stupid thing to do. Anyway, I've done it. There's nothing I can do about it. I can't take it back. But we will talk a little bit around it, I hope, over the next little while. First of all, I should thank APPI and, of course, for the British Council for the kind invitation to come here. I love coming back to Lisbon. Nowadays, I come here all the time. I came here for the first time to see Leonard Cohen about 4 or 5 years ago, the last night of his European tour, a wonderful night. He didn't finish until 1:10 so we had to walk back in from outside the city to our hotel, but it was well worth it. And that was the beginning of a love affair with Lisbon that I hope is going to go on for a while. Today I'm going to talk about assessment and assessment literacy in particular. I think that's really, it's an area that everybody sort of jumped on. It's like a bandwagon over the last number of years in assessment. If you go to assessment conferences, they're always about assessment literacy. So in a couple of months, we'll be going to Colombia and to Bogota, and the conference theme is about language assessment literacy. So finally, language testers have woken up to the realization that there is life beyond large-scale standardized testing. I don't know if all of them have fully accepted that, but it is coming, and it's with us, I believe, very strongly. So what am I going to talk about? First of all, I'm going to make a distinction between assessment and testing. Most people use the terms interchangeably, but for today at least, I think it makes a lot of sense if we think about them as two different things. So assessment, as you can see, relates to establishing progress or knowledge in order to help people to develop, whereas testing is establishing that same knowledge to make decisions about a person. So the first one is developmental, and the second one is judgmental. So I always find it much easier to think about, instead of summative and formative assessment, which don't really mean an awful lot anyway, if we think about it like that, one lot of assessment, we're trying to develop the learner, and the other lot of assessment, we're trying to make decisions about the learner. Now, there's always overlaps. It's not as easy. It's not simply a black and white idea. I'm going to talk a tiny bit about testing first. If I'm involved in developing a test, and you just heard that one of my recent projects was developing the APPI test system, I would use a model like this. This is called a socio-cognitive model of test validation and development, and gives you an idea of the kind of things we've got to think about when we're developing a test. We think about everything. We start with the test taker. Who are we testing and what do we want to say about this person? Then we think about the test system. How are we going to develop a system in order to allow us to help to say that about them? And then we think about the scoring system. How do we create a scoring system that's fair and reliable and valid, that will allow us to make claims about a person or about people that we can support? And all of those pieces have to work together. When we're developing, we have to think about the consequence of every decision we make. First of all, the consequence of having a test out there in the social domain anyway. What will happen? We all know that industry grows around language testing or any other testing. Standardized psychometric testing started about 100 years ago. And within 10 years, the first standardized tests in the US, the Curtis tests, had been taken by over 25 million people. So an industry developed almost immediately, like a mushroom. So we know that when we create a test and put it out there into the world, an industry is going to develop around that test. What are the consequences of that for the learners, for their teachers, for their parents? We have to try to take that into consideration in the way we design the test and in the way we design the systems around the test. But we also have to think about the consequence of every decision we make in the test development process. So if I decide to test reading, what level am I going to do it? Because am I going to have it multi-level, a single level? Every single decision I make causes other decisions to be made. It's like a domino effect, if you like. So it's a fairly complicated thing to take on board. You don't ever have to look at a diagram like this again, so you'll be very happy. It's only people who are committed language testers. And I actually was thinking, I usually start with a story or a joke, and I forgot the story I was thinking. But you were telling us, Arturo was telling us about, or Alberto was telling us about the possibility that this is being live streamed, and there's people in their pajamas watching this. I thought, wow, can you imagine sitting looking at me talking about testing in your pajamas? And then I thought, well, if that's to happen, it's likely to be in Brazil. And it's 5 o'clock in the morning. Anybody who's watching this from Brazil in their pajamas at 5 o'clock in the morning is as crazy as Brazilians have a reputation of being. Can you believe it? 5 o'clock in the morning. Mad stuff. Anyway, for 5 o'clock in the morning, this will wake you up, this model. This is like an alarm clock. But of course, teachers often get it wrong, as I'm sure you'll all agree. I was a teacher myself once, and I always assumed assessment wasn't just about these fancy models, because I didn't know anything about them. Whenever I went to a conference and I heard these famous testing people talking, they talked like that. And it was mind-boggling. It still happens. I've been to conferences that are aimed at teachers where testers stand up and they talk about stuff that only they know about. It's bonkers. But the reality is that it's not all about numbers and about statistics. That's only one line in all of the test development system that we try to make sure that we follow systematically when we're developing a test. So that's only one bit of it, but it's got us a bad reputation. Probably a well-deserved bad reputation, I have to admit. So let's go to the point, language assessment literacy. So what is it? Well, literacy is the ability to read and write. We all kind of know that. Nowadays, it's been expanded to think about competence or knowledge in a specified area. So you'll have different types of literacy. But competence is interesting because if you think of what competence means, it's the ability to do something. And the do something is the important bit. A lot of what we've done up to now in developing language assessment literacy systems has forgotten the whole point. The whole point was to help teachers to do something, not to make teachers like mini testers. That has been a mistake, and I think I'll point that out in a little while. Being an academic and a tester, I love definitions. So I've given you a definition, which I'm not going to read. You can read it yourself. But it's designed to help us to understand what I mean by assessment literacy. I'm sure there are as many testers in the world as there are people in this audience who will disagree with that. They'll have their own definition. But this is what I think it means. And it's all about creating systems that allow us to inform developmental and judgmental decisions. So it doesn't matter what kind of assessment or testing that we're going to do. We have to have some knowledge of assessment literacy. We have to know about it so that we can do it well. And I think that's the point that we want to take away from today. Who needs it? Well, not being conceited, I hope, in any way. I think everybody needs it. Everybody in society is touched in some way by assessment and testing. So therefore, everybody needs to have some understanding or some idea of what language assessment or testing actually means. Not the typical politician's idea of, oh, when I went to school it was great, so let's go back to that time. Or this is the way we should test, therefore that's the way to do it. Politicians are not the people who should make those decisions. But they should know something about it, because if they are going to make decisions, they should do it not purely from a position of ignorance, which often happens. And I apologize to any politicians who might be in the audience or on the web who are listening. But it's a fact that most politicians don't know anything about the things they make decisions about. But that's a politics rant of the day over. And why is it important? As a teacher, you live in what I'd consider a mad world. And if you think about it, I was asked a few years ago to create a visual representation about all of the opportunities around a language program, that opportunities for testing and assessment. And when I started, I began to think about, well, obvious placement and achievement. That's the obvious stuff. Everybody kind of knows that. But then, of course, we have progress tests, which most programs of any kind of length will have. Then we might have quizzes. Often teachers throw quizzes in on a very regular basis. We also have diagnostic tests that we might throw in at various stages during the program. We might have self-assessment or self-evaluation or even peer evaluation happening right through the program. We also have the peer assessment going on. We know as teachers that every day we're making constant decisions about our students. We look at our class, we're trying to teach them something. We don't just give out a lesson and then say, right, they got that. As a teacher, we're evaluating. Have they got it? Do they know that? How do I check it? Like, can you answer this question? What about you? Can you answer this question? So I'm evaluating, I'm assessing all the time as a teacher. If I'm a good teacher, I'm doing it every minute of my lesson. So it's happening all the time. It's in an informal way, and we do it without really thinking about it. We learn how to do it, because when we do our teacher training courses, we're never told how to do it. Like anybody else in this room, I finished my teacher training program many years ago, 40 years ago. I walked out of a teacher training program in Dublin into a school, and I didn't have a clue. I was lost in space. The only thing that saved my life, I was in a rough school in South Dublin. The only thing that saved my life was I played football. It had nothing to do with my teaching ability. It had nothing to do with my ability to keep students quiet in a room of lunatics sometimes. I played football. And they had a name. They saw me play football. I coached them. And that helped me into the classroom. I certainly knew nothing about assessment. The wildest part is within 5 years, I was writing leaving cert examinations and inter-cert, like our halfway through secondary school examinations. How I went from 0 to here, I don't know, and I still didn't know anything. It was only later, when I studied assessment, that I realized how chronically bad the system had been that I was involved in. And I would never give me a job. But we had all of these possibilities, and then we throw in people like me doing research. Well, can you help me with a baseline study for my research. So, and then I might say, well, actually, my students are preparing for a Cambridge exam, so there's a proficiency test in there as well. When you look at that world of opportunity for testing and assessment, you think, is there any room to learn? Because you could spend your whole life testing. So lesson 1 to walk away from today, don't test as much. If you're going to do it properly, but don't do it very often, because if you do, there's no time to learn. I used to teach in Japan many years ago in a secondary school. We had to test our students every Friday. Now, we only had them 1 day a week for English, but we had to test them on Friday. So 20% of my teaching time was lost to testing. When I tried to explain that to the school, they thought I was mad, because you have to test them every Friday. There's no choice. But you lose 20% of your time. And often the tests don't reflect the content of the program, which is a whole other daily rant of mine. Approaches to language assessment literacy over the years have been the theory-centered. So people like me will sit down with their books, and they look at all of the stuff in language testing, and then we'll make a questionnaire. And then I give it out to you teachers, and then I get it back. But you haven't told me what you want to learn. I now know. What you have told me is the bits that I think are important, that you know a little bit about, a lot about, nothing at all about. But you haven't told me stuff that, if there's stuff missing off my list, I'll never know. And that's a real problem. The expert-centered approach are people who come up with models. And I'm a great man for models myself. What a boxologist I was once called. I love my models and my boxes and stuff to explain stuff. But we have these theoretical models of what a teacher should or should not know, and the level of knowledge that a person might or might not know. But there's a problem with that, because the impact of all of those approaches can be best summed up by an empty box. So essentially, there hasn't been any. We've done lots of theoretical work. We've written articles, we've published them, we've written stuff in books. But teachers still go through a CERT, like a CELTA or a DELTA. You can do a CELTA and learn almost, well, actually, you can learn nothing at all about assessment. You can do a DELTA. DELTA is actually worse. Because when you do a DELTA or a diploma of any kind that I've seen, and I've looked at loads of them, the stuff that you do on assessment, you know, people talk about content validity, construct validity. You know, people nod when I say that. You know, when that idea came out, that idea was published a month before I was born. Yesterday I was 62. So when we're talking about theory, we're not talking up-to-date theory. Theories of validation have moved on dramatically since that time. But teachers are still being told about stuff that's so far out of date and is so unhelpful, because those theories were developed for large-scale standardized psychometric tests, not for classroom assessment. It hadn't the classroom in mind at all. So the stuff that was being done is essentially a waste of time. People need to learn something that's more appropriate to their own context. One of the big problems we have is that the experts who've been designing these systems, myself included, I hasten to add, are not related at all to the classroom. The last time I taught an English class was 1988. Now, that means that by this time, I have no idea of the reality of the classroom. So I have no idea of the challenges that teachers have or face every day. Because teaching, it's very unlikely to have stayed the same for the last how many years? Very, very unlikely. Teaching has moved on. Testers get it wrong. I'm not going to say where this happened, but I was at a conference last year, and we had a teacher's day. We had an expert panel, a whole bunch of local people, experts, genuinely expert people, and myself. We were all testers. This was a testing day for teachers. And the teachers asked the question, They said, we teach minority languages, like Maori and small languages like that. Now you know what I'm talking about. And we have very small classes. But you guys are really lucky because you're involved in English teaching. And there's all these standardized tests and psychometric tests, but we don't have any. So what should we do? So this is essentially what happened. Well, you could translate the current English test, somebody said. Then collect enough data, analyze the data, and norm the test. Bingo, you're ready to go. And to which I said, what? For me, it sounded bonkers, crazy, that you would say this to a bunch of teachers. So I asked them, what does enough data mean? Now, nobody would give an answer. And the reason they give an answer, they couldn't give an answer. You can't give an answer. It's not possible to answer that question. What's enough data to make a normed, standardized psychometric test? Because you need to know the population, you need to know lots about the population, and you need to do lots of statistical calculations to get your sample. As I was preparing for this, I thought to myself, it must be written down somewhere how to do this. So I went to all of the education measurement textbooks that are published every 20 years. These are the Bibles. This is how you do stuff. Nobody ever puts a number on paper because it's too difficult. The reality is we're looking at thousands. A quick calculation. These people, the teachers had told us their classes were between about 7 and 12, 15 students. Let's say an average of 10 people. If you have one class a year with 10 students and you need 1,000 people to have enough data, that's not a problem. All you have to do is teach for 100 years. You teach for 100 years, you collect the data. And then, of course, there's all of the analyzing. That's a whole different problem. So the problem lies in this crazy idea that we have, unfortunately, accepted that standardized psychometric tests are best way to test people. And clearly that's not the case. Why would you want it in the first place? And I did suggest to my colleagues that they needed a history lesson. 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, there were no standardized tests. The first standardized test was in 1904, a standardized test of handwriting by Thorndike. Then we had a composition version of that in 1911, and then we had the Curtis test in 1914. That's when the standardized tests started. Why did they start? They started because education was booming. Instead of having small schools with small classes spread all over, with teachers who were pretty well committed to what they were doing, you had massive industrial scale education with hundreds of thousands, and in the case of the US, millions of students studying. The problem was that an unstandardized test meant that you couldn't make comparisons across different areas and different schools. So you needed people doing the same test in the same way, etc. The business started because education was growing and growing and growing. Whereas the teachers we talked to here in individual classes had small numbers. Why would they want a standardized test? They're not going to compare you and you. Why should they? All they want to know is, do you know what you need to be able to survive when you go out of my class? And as an experienced teacher, you'll know that. The difficulties in a national-wide system, of course, means that you can't make those comparisons and you can't have teacher-driven assessment like that. But within a classroom or within a specific program, it makes no sense to use standardized tests in all those little sections. There's no point. You make your own. But if you're to make your own, you have to know something about how to do it. Of course, my colleagues still haven't forgiven me for questioning the need for standardized tests, and I'm in the bad books in that particular country. One solution in the British Council, what we've tried to do over the last few years is we started this project, a language assessment literacy course. Because what we want to do is we want to embed assessment literacy in the organization. And because we want to give people enough knowledge to be able to talk to each other sensibly about what it might mean. The difficulty is it's a big organization. There's about 7,500 people working for the organization around the world. And people do all kinds of different jobs, and there's just some of the jobs that the organization does. People in these jobs need different levels of knowledge and understanding of what assessment means. But they all need something. Some of them just need very basic knowledge, and others, I think, need quite a lot of knowledge. If we just look at the English and exams, that's the section I work in, staff, we're basically divided into exam staff and teaching and administration staff. Those numbers are daft, they're too low. But those are the kind of roles that people are doing. So what we're trying to do is to help everybody understand what assessment means. It's not just good enough, for example, in a school, that teachers know what assessment is. The administrators need to know something about assessment as well. So if you're helping, for example, as an administrator, if you're helping a teacher to set up an exam, well, you should have some idea of why you're doing these things. So if you have some idea of why you're doing things, then you'll know what you're doing and you'll do them better. At least that's my theory. The hypothetical expectation is, and this is an idea taken from this Harding and Pill paper, that there are different levels of knowledge. The first one is nominal. Nominal means I know that I know the term validity. I have no real idea what it means. I might remember a definition. I might know that it's in this book somewhere, but it doesn't touch my life in any way. It's something. But I do know it. Validity. Yes, validity. Nobody knows what validity is, I don't think, to be honest. But let's say a nominal idea is that you just have a general picture. A functional means that you can either deliver it or you can talk about it in a very simple way. Procedural and conceptual means that you can actually do it. So you can conceive of a test. As a teacher, you can think about what do I need to test, how do I need to do it, this is how I do it, I can put my test together, this is going to be particularly suitable for my particular class, this will work for me. And then the final level, of course, the multidimensional, is the sort of expert level. As you can see, it's very unlikely that we'd have many people at a multidimensional level. Though, because of the kind of work we do, and we heard earlier from the country director what the kind of work we do, is when we negotiate with ministries, we often need this expert level. So in 2 weeks' time or something like that, I'll be off in China talking to people at the education ministry, I hope at a multidimensional expert level, about some projects that we're working on. So different people then in the organization will need different levels of literacy for right across the board. And you can see that that's just what our hypothetical expectation was when we started this, that teachers, obviously you would need the nominal, you need to know what it is, you need the functional, but it stops, you need to have quite a strong procedural and conceptual knowledge, which in the current situation doesn't happen. If we focus on teachers then, as we did, we thought, well, let's get information from as many different perspectives as possible. We weren't, unfortunately, able to go into the classroom to see what people do. That is something that we have yet to do, because that's very important. But we gathered information from the teachers themselves. And based on the information our own teachers gave us, we came up with, of course, a questionnaire. The outcome of that, we asked about 750 teachers around the world in the British Council to give us feedback. And this is the kind of thing they were talking about. So on the blue column, you see, these are the things they said that they'd really like to know about. The other stuff, yeah, that would be nice. But the other blue one was the main one. So we've come up now with a plan, and the plan is here. And you can see that for the different areas that they told us they want to know about, we also looked at the amount of information that they would probably need to do their job. Again, asking them to tell us, what do you need and what are the kind of things that you think are going to help. And we've realized that we can create a matrix approach. So now this will form the basis of a curriculum, if you like, for teachers within the British Council so that they can learn an appropriate amount about language testing. If you notice, the statistics is only functional. So the absolute minimum functional. So if you give a test to your class, you can do the minimum amount of analysis of the test would be something like, is there a question in my test that nobody got right? Because that's a problem. Is there a question in my test that everybody got right? That might be a problem, but if it's an achievement or a progress test, that might be a good thing, and you might be saying, great, they got that, every one of them got it. But if it's a progress test and nobody got something right, you haven't done your job. You need to go back and think again and maybe repeat what you should have done, but do it properly this time. So basic statistics can help, but I'm talking basic. I remember 1998, I was teaching an MA program for the first time, and I walked in, and I was as nervous as the students, I realized. But on the night that we were about to teach the course, the first stage of the basic statistics section of the course, I had 2 students in the room in tears. Before we started, they just assumed that the basic statistics would be too much for them. When I talk about basic, I mean basic. If you can go to the shop and buy something and give some money in and get the right change and know you got the right change, then you can do the statistics that you need as a teacher. You don't need any more. You certainly don't need any of these fancy formulas ever. I don't use those fancy formulas ever. We have a statistician in our group, and that's her job. It is not mine. That is as much gibberish to me as it is to you, I can tell you. We don't need it. The other thing that we've done on the nominal side, because so many people in our organization need a nominal understanding of assessment, we've created on this website, and I'm sure these slides will be available at some point to you if you want to use them. We've created a whole series, there's a dozen up there now, of animated videos. These are about 5 minutes long, and they're non-technical. There's no technical language used in it. If there is a technical word used, it's explained, but it's the absolute minimum of technical language. What we've tried to do then, for example, is with the practical ones, we've taken them and we're creating the animation. We're also now about to put up in the next week or two a series of worksheets that teachers or trainers can use to help understand how best to use the video for themselves. These ideas, the idea of these videos is to give you, as a teacher, a general understanding of how different aspects of assessment and testing work together. They're not meant to go into these more advanced levels. They're just to give you an overview. For many people in our organization, all they have to do is look at these videos. They're not expected to know anything else. So, for example, if you're an administrator and you help set up tests of speaking, it's a really good idea to look at the video once or twice, and you get an idea, yeah, this is what it's all about. So this is why I would set it up in this way. And that's enough. You don't need any more. And in many cases, for a teacher, as you could see, we had a profile. You don't have to be expert at everything. You only have to have a fairly basic knowledge of some areas. So for some of the things, like, for example, up there, the second one is validity. Validity is one of the most complex ideas or notions. It's become so complicated over the last, particularly 60 years, that I'm working on a book at the moment with an American colleague, and it's absolutely hilarious because the American concept of validity and the British concept of validity are completely different. And it took us months to realize that the title of the book is Validity, but we were talking about two different things and arguing most of the time. We've now got to the stage where we've stopped arguing, but we still haven't written anything. Well, we have, but she's written one thing, which is brilliant, and I've written something which I think is all right, but we can't put them together because one is saying exactly the opposite of the other, or more or less. So validity is a fantastically difficult concept. So what I've tried to do here is, being totally biased, I've given my opinion of what validity is. And with pardon of the Americans in the audience, but let's not worry about what the Americans think in terms of validity. This is what, the Irishman working in the UK thinks, but this is what the British Council thinks of what validity is. And it's a general overview in a non-technical way. And how we did it was, and this is a true story, I wrote the script for this. People write books on validity. Papers, 100 pages long, famous one from 1990-something. 100 pages about validity. Anybody in this audience, if you can't sleep, if you suffer from insomnia, just start reading it. I can guarantee 2 or 3 pages you will sleep like a baby. When I wrote it first, and I first of all showed it to the family, and they looked at it and they thought, we have no idea what this means. So they helped me to rewrite it. And then I showed it to some friends I knew, some neighbors, and they read it. They know nothing about education or assessment. Showed it to them, they got back to me. Then I showed it to some teachers, and they kind of got back to me. And then I sent it to this animation company with no explanation. So, there it is, make the animation. And he interpreted the words and created the video. And I think it's really good. Because you don't need any technical background to read, to listen and look at any of these. They're supposed to be mildly entertaining. And I bet you never thought in your life you would be entertained by assessment or testing. But I can guarantee it may not be Mickey Mouse, but it's not Disney, but it's not bad. But it's certainly a way to go. And as you can see, what we're trying to do now is this is one step. This is that nominal step. We're also now moving on through the worksheets into the functional step. So that, okay, this is the idea, now this is how you use it. And we have a third step that we're creating a CPD and a MOOC for that we will be doing later this year. So eventually, you will have all of the steps in place. Now, my final word is probably longer than final words normally are. Normally a final word is a final word, but being an Irishman, I can't have a final word. There has to be words. In fact, this had 3 sections until about an hour ago. And then I always change my presentation at the last minute. Something I've always told my students never do. I always do, because my head never stops and I never stop questioning what I'm doing. So the final word, technology. Everybody in the planet thinks about technology. This is my own life in technology. We all had in the 1960s, 1962, RTE television started, and we got a television. My father loved television, so we had television. And we moved on. This is actually the first computer I ever had in 1988. It was my pride and joy, my Apple. You look at it now, you think people think, what is it? That was a wonderful machine. Now, I have an iPhone. I can't say I have a watch. I prefer a watch that is a watch that I can see and works. I'm kind of traditional and old-fashioned in that way. We have no idea what this is going to be like. That's the reality. We know that everything is changing faster than we can think. And what those changes will mean to teaching and to assessment, we honestly don't know. We're pretty sure that in 10 years' time, assessment as we know it now will not be like this at all. I'm pretty well certain that I don't think I'll see the day, but certainly in the next 20 to 30 years, there won't be any exams. There won't be any need for it. If we were allowed now, today, to abandon exams, we could. Not for everybody. But if we did it in contexts where people are learning digitally, where we have access to everything they do, there's no need to test them. We can do that today. We know already. We have all kinds of systems that we're already working with that if we were to pull them together, it would cost loads and loads of money, of course. But we could create a system where we could establish your level of language proficiency purely through your work on a language program over time. No problem. In fact, we are only probably a couple of years away from being able to do it even in the productive skills. If you think about speaking, for example, in the 1990s we had an exam called Phone Pass. Everybody thought this was the greatest thing. I hated Phone Pass because with my Irish accent, every time I called the telephone, I failed the exam because it didn't understand me. So I never liked it. I've been biased against it ever since. I was told they had no Irish-English model. Thank you very much. But that continues to evolve, and the Versant and Pearson tests that you see today use that same 1990s technology. It's not the same as it was in 1990, of course. It's moved on since then. But it's still basically 1990s technology. If we look at the 2000s, we have sound and voice recognition coming in for the first time. And if you can look at the TOEFL tests, for example, if you look at their practice tests, you can do an online practice speaking test on the TOEFL website, pay about, I don't know, $15 or something like that, and get a pretty decent estimation of what your level is. They reckon it's about 80% accurate. That's why they won't make it, they don't push it into the public domain as an actual live exam, because they think, well, that's not accurate enough, which I think is pretty good. Now, we're looking at something radically different. We're looking at speech recognition and self-learning systems, artificial intelligence systems that are teaching themselves. In the first one, if I create a test for speaking, I have to get hundreds and hundreds of samples of people responding to that. And I've got to get them rated by human examiners. And then I feed all the data into the system. And the system then gets an idea of what to expect. By now, I don't need to do that anymore. Like right today, one of the reasons I'm going to China in a few weeks is to talk to these guys where we're actually building a system where you can just start putting candidate responses to a topic into the system. It teaches itself. And it gives a score that's well over 80% accurate. So that is happening right now. It's limited, of course. It's only one language group. We're not sure how it would work with the broader world of language users. But it's coming. You know, we can do it today. They have, one of the companies in China already have an app for practice for one of the major language tests that you can access the app, go through the test, and it gives you a score that's amazingly close to the scores awarded by examiners for the same test. So that already exists. So this is changing everything. My thinking, though, is that it's going to change things in an interesting way. Some people think, well, there won't be any need for teachers anymore because everything will be learned digitally. Well, that is absolutely not going to happen. What there probably won't be any need for is for teachers to assess on a systematic basis, because you can, by gathering information about your students systematically across the program, you can assess them. Or the system will assess them. You don't need to do it. So the teacher, that puts actually, in terms of assessment, added pressure on the teacher, because the teacher's got to know how the system works. Otherwise, the system may not be getting it right, because systems are systems. They're not human. They may be reliable, but they're reliable in a technical way, and a technical way means that they're consistent. Reliability equals consistency. Consistency doesn't mean accuracy. A system can be always wrong. So when you look at the reliability number for a test, unless somebody gives you other information about that test, that number means nothing at all, 0. That test could be always wrong. That's all. That's all it's telling you. All the number, when you see reliability equals 0.92, it just means that 81% of the time the result is going to be the same. That's all it means. Nothing else. It could be wrong 81% of the time. It might only be right 19. The chances of that happening, we hope, are slim, but that is possible. So teachers are going to have know more about assessment, if anything, even though they don't have to do it. So the balance is going to change, but the teacher will still be needed, because we're already beginning to get backlashes for things like blended learning and for digital learning. Students are already beginning to report in research studies that they're not happy. They're not getting the kind of training and learning environments that they need. It suits some people, it doesn't suit others. And I think that's the message that we have to come away with. But of course, the big thing that we have to think about, as far as I'm concerned, if we think back on what I've been talking about today, you have a tester talking to teachers about assessment. And you think, man, that is wrong, you know. And I've already been pointing out how assessment people and teaching people live on different worlds often. You know, we talk different languages. We certainly don't try to talk those languages to each other. So what we have to do, I believe, is to change the way we think about things, so that we join teachers and testers. We start to think about things in the same way. So we think about language assessment literacy for teachers, but we also think about language teaching and learning literacy for testers. So maybe the next time I come here, I'll do a talk on what do testers know about teaching. Thank you very much.